Picture this, right? You are at a massive work event. There are maybe 40, 50 people in the room. You've got those stiff conference badges, the awkward name tags.
Oh, yeah, and someone is inevitably already laughing way too loudly over by the drinks table.
Exactly. And you are just clutching a lukewarm cup of coffee, standing strategically near, like a structural pillar, and you're pretending to be deeply engrossed in your phone for exactly 11 minutes straight.
It is a highly specific yet universally agonizing scenario. I mean, I think we can all feel that mild spike in cortisol just picturing it.
Right, you're swiping between apps, not reading a single word, just waiting for someone to initiate contact. Because stepping into a circle of strangers feels like navigating a minefield without a map.
Oh, absolutely.
So today's deep dive is aimed directly at anyone who relies on that structural pillar. We're unpacking a really fascinating script from a show called Sharp English, specifically their third episode, which is all about networking for introverts.
And the core premise of this source material fundamentally shifts how we should, view this anxiety.
Yep.
Because the script argues that struggling to mingle is not a personality flaw.
Okay, that is a huge relief to hear.
Right, standing by the wall doesn't mean you are fundamentally broken or, antisocial. It is simply a language problem. You are essentially trying to operate complex social software without having the correct linguistic code.
That reframing takes so much burden off your identity. You don't need to suddenly transform into this charismatic extrovert. You just need, well, a better set of tools.
Exactly.
It's kind of like trying to jump onto a fast-moving treadmill without tripping. It feels impossible until someone actually shows you exactly where to step first. And that is our mission today. We are decoding the exact linguistic frames from Sharp English.
And we should clarify these are flexible structures, not rigid, robotic scripts you memorize.
Right, right. Frames that can take you from that agonizing coffee station freeze to a really graceful, memorable exit. So where do we actually start?
Well, the source starts by breaking down the literal architecture of initiating an exchange. Because before any meaningful connection happens, you have to overcome the paralyzing fear of interrupting.
Which is so real.
I mean, at these events, people are already clustered, right? You're almost always going to be an interrupter, which triggers all our social conditioning about, not being a nuisance.
Which usually results in that terrible hovering behavior. You stand just outside the circle, smiling rigidly, waiting for this magical pause in conversation that just never comes.
Oh, the hover is the worst. But to bypass that anxiety, the source highlights a very specific linguistic frame designed to diffuse the tension by just naming it.
Okay, what's the phrase?
If you want to approach a small group, the recommended phrase is, mind if I crash the conversation?
Okay, I can see how that functions, but let me push back slightly on that wording.
Sure.
In a formal professional setting, using the word crash might scan as a bit, I don't know, aggressive. It almost implies you are about to, physically knock over their verbal buffet table.
I completely get that. And that hesitation makes total sense if we look at it purely as formal vocabulary. But if we analyze the social dynamics at play, the word crash is actually the exact mechanism that relieves the tension.
Wait, really? How so?
Think about the reality of the hovering you just mentioned. Everyone in that small group already sees you standing there. They know you are listening. So that hovering creates this unspoken awkwardness. It's the elephant in the room.
I see. So by using a slightly disruptive, highly self-aware word like crash, you are deliberately pointing at the elephant.
Exactly. You're giving up the pretense that you just happened to wander by. You are naming the dynamic.
That makes a lot of sense, actually.
The source points out that removing this pretense instantly relaxes the group's cognitive load. They no longer have to politely pretend they didn't see you hovering, and you don't have to pretend you weren't desperately looking for a way in.
So it brings a touch of humility and humor that just neutralizes the whole bystander effect. You're essentially giving everyone permission to acknowledge the awkwardness and move past it.
That's spot on. But the dynamic obviously changes if it's just a one-on-one situation.
Right, because if I'm at the coffee urn and someone else is just pouring milk, I can't really say, mind if I crash, to a single person without sounding completely unhinged.
Yeah, please don't do that. The strategy shifts entirely for a one-on-one opener. The source recommends a very different lower-stakes frame for this. What did you make of that last session?
Oh, that is so much better. It completely bypasses the standard panicked introduction. Usually when the silence gets too loud, my default is to launch into, "Hi, I'm so-and-so, I work in marketing."
Which is actually a surprisingly high-pressure way to open a dialogue.
Is it?
Yeah. As the sharp English script notes, leading with your name and title puts the entire weight of the interaction squarely on the other person. They suddenly have to process your identity and formulate a reaction to you before they have any shared context.
Oh, wow, you're right. It's almost asking for immediate validation. Whereas asking, what did you make of that last session? Totally lowers the cognitive load.
Exactly. You aren't asking them to evaluate you. You are inviting them to look at a neutral third object together. It creates shared context instantly.
That's brilliant.
And there's also a highly practical secondary benefit to this specific phrasing. It functions as a behavioral filter.
They filter, like to weed people out.
Yes. If you ask for their thoughts on the session and they offer a flat, one-word answer like, it was fine, and then they immediately turn away, the frame has done its job.
Oh, I see the utility there.
Yeah?
If they give a closed-off answer, it's actually a gift. It filters out people who have absolutely no intention of engaging.
Exactly, which saves you 20 minutes of agonizing dead-end chatter.
And because you haven't invested your ego by pitching your own identity first, the rejection doesn't even sting. You're just like testing the structural integrity of the ice before deciding to skate on it.
I love that analogy. Now, once you have successfully breached the perimeter and they give a thoughtful answer, the next challenge is preventing the conversation from devolving into a standard, generic recital of resumes.
Ugh, the dreaded what do you do trap.
Oh.
It is astounding how quickly that question just drains the oxygen from a room.
It really does.
It feels like forcing someone to read their own IMDb page out loud. You flatten this complex, multidimensional human being into their past credits or their current corporate label.
The IMDb analogy is perfectly aligned with the source's warning here. The what do you do question explicitly boxes someone into their formal title.
Right. And that title might have absolutely nothing to do with what they're actually passionate about or focused on at that moment. They say, I'm a mid-level supply chain analyst, and suddenly you're both trapped in that narrow definition, struggling to find a way out.
To bypass this entirely, the script suggests a more expansive alternative. What's keeping you busy outside of events like this?
Oh, that fundamentally changes the required response. It's like instead of putting them in a tiny windowless box, you're handing them the keys to a larger room where they can show off what actually makes them tick.
That's a great way to look at it. It gives them the agency to choose their own narrative rather than just stating their rank.
They could talk about a massive problem they are actively trying to solve at work, or a side project, or even a hobby. You are optimizing the conversation for enthusiasm.
You're asking for a narrative rather than a label. However, the source includes a critical cultural caveat right here, which is really essential for navigating global or highly structured environments.
Okay, what's the caveat?
Not every corporate culture operates as a casual, egalitarian space. In more hierarchical settings, people actually require the exchange of job titles to calibrate the interaction.
Oh, sure, because they need to know exactly where you sit in the ecosystem to apply the correct social protocol.
Precisely. The calibration is a safety mechanism for them. If you completely bypass the title and just ask what's keeping you busy, they might feel a bit unsettled by the breach of expected norms.
That makes sense. You might actually create anxiety because they don't know how to appropriately address you or weigh your input. So how do we handle that without falling back into the IMDb trap?
The source offers a really elegant structural blend to navigate this. You say, what do you do, and what's the most interesting thing on your plate right now?
Ah, so you satisfy the cultural requirement by letting them state their rank, but you immediately provide an off-ramp from the IMDb page in the exact same breath.
Yes. You give them the formal structure, but pivot the focus towards something dynamic. Now, once they answer that prompt, the way you respond determines whether the interaction becomes a genuine connection or just, parallel monologuing.
Right, because many people falter here by just nodding politely, or worse, committing the classic conversational hijack.
Oh, the hijack.
Yeah, where they immediately pivot back to their own completely unrelated achievements, like, oh, you're streamlining supply chains. Well, that reminds me of my award-winning marketing campaign.
It completely severs the connection. To prevent that, the source offers a framing technique to link the two experiences. They call it the bridge phrase.
Okay, lay the bridge on me.
It goes like this. That's interesting. We ran into something similar when we were. And then you map your experience onto the underlying mechanism of what they just shared.
So you are proving active synthesis. You aren't just waiting for your turn to speak. You are taking the abstract concept of their problem and showing exactly how it applies to your world.
Exactly. It moves the dynamic from an interview, where you are just peppering them with questions, into a collaborative peer exchange. It's the structural pivot from me and you to us.
That is so powerful. Okay, so now the conversation is flowing bilaterally. We are connecting. But how do you ensure you are actually leaving a positive, lasting impression?
This is where the script cites a highly counterintuitive insight from Harvard research, and it's probably the most important part of the entire deep dive.
Okay, I'm leaning in because most of us assume the burden of making a good impression lies entirely in our own performance, right?
That's the standard assumption, yes.
We rehearse anecdotes, we memorize industry news, we try so hard to ensure we have interesting things to say so we appear valuable to the other person.
Well, the Harvard data totally dismantles that assumption. The secret to being perceived as memorable, likable, and intelligent has very little to do with the impressiveness of your own anecdotes.
Wait, really?
Truly. The highest ROI behavior is simply asking follow-up questions.
Just asking follow-ups.
Yes. The research found that individuals who ask follow-ups are consistently rated far higher in intelligence and competence by their conversation partners than those who just share impressive facts.
That mechanism is fascinating. The person doing less of the talking is actually perceived as more intelligent.
It's incredible, isn't it?
It likely ties into the halo effect. When you give someone your focused attention, they process that social validation as a massive reward. They feel good, and they unconsciously project the source of that positive feeling, which is you, as being highly competent and smart.
You are facilitating a dopamine response through genuine curiosity. I mean, think about it. Most people at these events are vibrating with the anxiety of needing to pitch themselves.
Oh, 100%. It's just a room full of people waiting to speak.
Right, so if you are the rare person who redirects the spotlight onto them, you stand out immediately. And the ultimate phrase the source provides to trigger this effect is staggeringly simple.
What is it?
After they share an update or a project, you just ask, "And how did that go for you?"
Wow. And how did that go for you? It's so open-ended. It's like a behavioral prompt that invites the unpolished reality.
Exactly.
Because if someone says, we just rolled out a new software platform, and you reply with, great, the conversation basically hits a dead end. You've just accepted the corporate press release.
But asking, "And how did that go for you?" opens a vault of authenticity. The source uses this great role-play example to illustrate it. Prompted by this exact phrase, the speaker admits the rollout actually took 4 extra months and resulted in a severely strained relationship with the CTO.
Oh, wow. The real story.
Yeah, they didn't lead with that reality initially because they weren't sure you were actually invested in the answer.
The follow-up question is the key that unlocks the human element. It proves you have the bandwidth to handle the messy reality, not just the sanitized elevator pitch. I gotta say, it really highlights the difference between performing and connecting.
That's a great distinction.
Because performance invites evaluation, but connection bypasses evaluation entirely.
That is beautifully put. Now, once you reach that level of authenticity, you've likely hit the high point of the interaction. But here's the catch. A deep conversation can rapidly degrade if it isn't closed properly.
Oh, the exit is so hard to extract yourself gracefully.
It really is. We can look at this through the lens of Kahneman's peak end rule. That rule states that people judge an experience largely based on how they felt at its peak and at its end. So knowing how to land the plane is critical.
Because if you linger too long, the energy just dissipates. You run out of things to say, the awkward silence creeps back in, and both parties start feeling trapped.
And that feeling of being trapped ruins the memory of the peak. You have to be able to disengage without making the other person feel dismissed.
So what's the strategy?
The exit is arguably the most highly engineered part of the script. The source provides a perfectly calibrated phrase for this. "It's been really good talking to you. I don't want to keep you, but I'd love to stay in touch."
Oh, that is smooth. The psychology of I don't want to keep you is brilliant.
Isn't it?
Yeah, because you are framing the exit as an act of generosity. If you say, I need to go, it centers your own boredom or busyness. But centering their time releases them from the social obligation of entertaining you.
It completely preserves their status while initiating the break. And attaching "I'd love to stay in touch" directly to that release makes the exchange of contact details feel like a logical, organic next step.
Rather than a transactional demand.
Exactly. But before you actually walk away, the source recommends dropping a final anchor question.
An anchor question.
Yeah, you say, "Before I let you go, what's the one thing you're hoping to take away from today?"
That is incredibly smart. It serves a dual purpose. It shifts the conversation away from whatever technical topic you were discussing and grounds the interaction back in their personal motivations.
And practically speaking, it gives you the exact material you need for a customized follow-up later.
Yes,
Yeah.
because you are gathering the data for a high-value touch point. When you send that LinkedIn message later that day, you aren't sending a generic, nice to meet you.
Which nobody ever responds to.
Right. Instead, you can reference the specific insight on data integration or leadership or whatever they mentioned they were looking for.
Yeah.
It absolutely cements the impression that you were an active listener from start to finish.
This framework builds immense trust. But, and this is a big but, the source also details how easily that trust can be shattered if you mishandle the follow-through.
Okay, I feel like I'm about to get called out. What are the specific pitfalls, the networking sins, if you will, that we need to avoid as we execute these frames?
Well, there are two major behavioral errors highlighted. The first is a phrase that almost all of us use. It relies heavily on vague signaling, saying, let's grab coffee sometime.
Oh, no. I definitely do that. I literally just used that on Tuesday. It feels like such a polite, non-threatening way to signal goodwill as you walk away. Why is that bad?
Well, it signals goodwill, sure, but it simultaneously signals very low intent because the phrase carries absolutely no commitment, no specific timeline, and no actionable mechanism.
Oh,
It actually degrades the trust you just spent 20 minutes building. The source notes that when a professional hears, let's grab coffee sometime, their brain automatically translates it to, I am adhering to polite social conventions, but I have absolutely no intention of following up.
oh, that makes me cringe. Because it's so true. Vagueness really is the enemy of momentum. It's the professional equivalent of saying we should hang out, which everyone understands is essentially a polite fiction.
Exactly. To maintain the trust, you need actionable specificity.
So what do we do instead?
You promise an action you fully control. You say, I'll send you a message on LinkedIn this afternoon with that article we discussed. And this is the crucial part, you actually execute it before you leave the venue.
Oh, I love that. Specificity breeds credibility. And keeping a minor promise on day one establishes a solid baseline of reliability.
Precisely.
Okay, what is the second major pitfall?
The second error is an issue of sequencing. It's announcing that you are actively looking for new job opportunities within the first 5 minutes of the conversation.
Oof. Yeah, that immediately violates the reciprocal nature of the exchange. You are forcing an unearned transaction onto a stranger before establishing any foundational trust.
It places the other person in an incredibly compromised position. They don't know your capabilities, they can't vouch for your work ethic, and by introducing a heavy request immediately, you trigger their defensive protocols.
Right. They will spend the rest of the conversation wondering if your curiosity is genuine or if it's just a preamble to asking for a favor.
You weaponize the interaction, basically. The entire goal of these linguistic frames from Sharp English is to build the connection first. If you establish yourself as an intelligent, empathetic listener using the follow-up techniques we discussed, that transaction might naturally occur later.
But if you reverse the order, the connection never solidifies.
Connection is always the prerequisite for transaction. The tools we've analyzed today, naming the awkwardness to break the ice, bypassing the title trap, unlocking the real narrative with targeted follow-ups, and executing a generous exit, they are all designed to fulfill that prerequisite.
It fundamentally changes the objective of walking into that room. You aren't there to prove how smart you are. You're there to deploy a set of tools that allow other people to feel heard. We've mapped the journey from the anxiety of the pillar, right, all the way to a graceful disengagement.
We have.
And what's so encouraging is realizing that networking isn't this innate talent reserved for the highly charismatic. It is simply having the right linguistic operating system to let your genuine curiosity function efficiently.
You know, if we step back and examine the underlying mechanics of this system, there's a broader application I'd really like to leave you with.
Okay, let's hear it.
If Harvard research proves that being a genuinely curious listener, using simple, low-pressure frames like, and how did that go for you, reliably makes strangers rate you as more competent and intelligent in a high-pressure professional setting, it raises a really compelling question.
Which is?
How might adopting this exact listener-first, follow-up heavy framework completely transform the way you navigate difficult personal conflicts or high-stakes negotiations with the people in your everyday life?
Man, that is a phenomenal thread to pull on.
Yeah.
Imagine bringing that level of engineered curiosity home to your family, or into a really tense team meeting. It's
Exactly.
something to actively monitor the next time you feel the urge to prove how interesting you are, instead of deploying the tools to just be interested. So keep testing those frames, keep asking the follow-ups, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.